of June. We're continuing our mini-series on Paul. I'm in chapter 2 here of Paul and Jesus, How the Apostle Transformed Christianity by James D. Tabor. As I had hinted before, I thought that I was going to be reading the whole chapter, but I really don't need to do that. I can mostly summarize it. There are some couple of sections I might want to read through, but I've skipped up to about the halfway point. I don't really have as much of a beef with Paul on this point that he's covering here, but it is important background for information and material we'll be covering later in the book. So we'll get into it. The first part of this chapter, he does a survey of the ancient Hebrew understanding of death, shows how the Hebrew understanding of death and resurrection sort of evolved with time just by doing a brief survey of the Old Testament. He showed that the Hebrews had a more, I guess, agnostic or skeptical view of death, a more cynical view of death, and then over time you get a more definitive, I guess, theology of life after death. And then, of course, in Daniel, you have a more explicit reference to a resurrection. But then he contrasts Paul's view of the resurrection with two extreme positions. So what he considers to be the two extreme positions here that he's contrasting Paul's view with. The first being the dualistic view of the Greeks, or the Platonic view, where you have the physical perishable body that goes away forever, contrasted with the immortal imperishable soul. And then you have the opposite view, which many Pharisees and Orthodox Jews in Paul's day had, which is that the original physical body, the cadaver, the corpse, would be resuscitated, revived, and reconstituted in the resurrection. He says Paul did not hold that idea. It's very clear from Paul's writings, 1 Corinthians 15, 2 Corinthians 5, and other places where he sees the immortal body growing up, literally growing, at the same time that the old man is dying. It's really important to understand that because it informs everything about Paul's theology. His view of the Old and New Covenants, his view of the Eucharist. He believes that as the New Covenant was coming into its own, it was still existed side by side, contemporaneously with the Old Testament, which was gradually falling away, dying, and expiring. It was on its last legs in his view. The Eucharist, he literally believed that when you ate and drank the body and blood of Christ, these elements were an antidote to the mortal body, and you were literally gradually becoming immortal. And this is the view, of course, of the Paulists in subsequent centuries, later centuries. Ignatius and Irenaeus believed essentially the same thing about the Eucharist, that it was the medicine of immortality, as they called it, that had this effect on the inner man and literally communicated immortality at the same time that the physical body was in the process of decaying and passing away and dying. This whole construct of Paul is not the one that would have been held by Jesus and the 12 apostles. That will become even clearer as we proceed with the book in later chapters, and we've already covered a lot of things that point towards Paul being a very problematic figure for Christianity and him really not falling in line at all with the teaching of the 12, preferring his whole ministry was conducted independently of theirs. He had no respect for their leadership. You know, in Galatians, he says he does not confer with flesh and blood. He did not need to confer with the apostles. He says somewhere there in Galatians, I don't remember the reference, that he basically channels Jesus. He doesn't use the word channel, but he says that he receives direct revelation from God, which he considers to be superior to any information he could have gleaned from the 12 by means of flesh and blood, in other words. We're looking at two different Christianities: the early Christianity of Jesus, which was taken over by James, and then a subsequent Christianity, Pauline Christianity. So anyway, the takeaway from this chapter, and I think all we really need to do is a basic summary of it. Rather than reading all these sections, I think there's a little bit I may read here, but the point is that Paul's view of the resurrection does not require, in his mind, that there be evidence for the physical resurrection of Jesus, but rather all that was necessary in Paul's mind was to witness Jesus in a spiritual body or subtle form after the burial. And of course, I would argue the same, that of James and the 12, I don't think that they held necessarily Paul's view of the resurrection, but it would have been similar enough to Paul's view that the one thing they both would have had in common was the non-necessity for Jesus' physical body being resuscitated. That's the big takeaway. So let me just read a little section from here. I might skip forward and then read a little bit more from another section. He basically says that there are two related but separate concepts of resurrection of the dead in the Bible. So the first involves the rare case where a prophet or holy man resuscitates the corpse of one who has recently died, so that the person has a reprieve on death, but eventually grows old and dies like anyone else, right? So then he lists a bunch of biblical, well, not a bunch, there's a couple, examples in the Bible of this. Elijah does it, and so on. With the son of the Shunammite woman. Of course, there was Lazarus, who had already been buried for 2 days. Jesus goes to his tomb and asks that the stone be removed, and he shouts, "Lazarus, come forth." Then he says most scholars agree that there is only one unambiguous reference to a general resurrection of the dead in the entire Hebrew Bible. It is found in the book of Daniel, an uncharacteristically apocalyptic book, considered by scholars to have been written much later than the other books of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. And he quotes Daniel 12, 1-3 on the resurrection. The author goes on and says the metaphor of sleeping in the dust of the earth and then awakening captures precisely the core idea of resurrection of the dead in the context of the ancient Hebrew understanding of death. The dead come forth from Sheol and are judged at the end of time, receiving either everlasting life or shame and contempt. Their bodies have long ago decayed and turned to dust, so rather than a resuscitation of a corpse, their revival entails a transformed state of glorified immortal existence. So I'm going to skip forward. Talks a little bit about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, their view on things. Of course, the Sadducees oppose the idea of the resurrection, while the Pharisees and the Essenes accepted it. The views of the Pharisees were accepted by the general populace. Um, the Essenes are most often identified with the sect that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. Books like Daniel and Enoch, in which the idea of resurrection of the dead is pivotal, inspired their decidedly apocalyptic views. Both Jesus and Paul stood squarely with the Pharisees and the Essenes. Let me see what else. The idea of resuscitating corpses or reassembling decayed flesh and bones long perished or turned to dust did not even enter the picture. Metaphorically, one could speak of those in the graves coming forth, but since the grave ultimately referred to the underworld of Hades or Sheol, even those, quote unquote, buried at sea come forth. And he quotes Revelation 20 there. The Jewish notion of resurrection of the dead never means disembodied bliss or even life after death, but always a re-embodied life. This is quite different from the Greek idea of the immortal soul being freed from the mortal body and experiencing heavenly bliss. So then he goes on to talk about Paul. Paul was a Pharisee, one of the three major schools of thought among Jews of that time. He gives us our earliest and most extensive treatment of resurrection of the dead as understood, debated, and defended by his contemporaries. There are rabbinic traditions that discuss the Pharisaic view of resurrection of the dead, but they date much later, from the 3rd to 5th centuries AD. Josephus, our other first century Jewish witness, offers little on this subject. Like Paul, he was a Pharisee, but provides none of the expository detail that Paul provides, and he seems eager to cast the Pharisees and their views of afterlife in Greek dress. And then he quotes Josephus. Then he quotes Paul in 2 Corinthians. Though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed every day, because we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. One would be hard-pressed to find a more succinct expression of Platonic dualism. The body is obviously the outer perishing nature, which can be seen, while the unseen inner nature, which is eternal, is the soul. Paul is making use of standard Greek language, but then he adds a most important twist. According to Paul, we humans are, quote, clothed in a physical body, which we shed at death, but our desire is not to end up naked or unclothed. That is, stripped of the body, as Plato would have it, but to be reclothed with a new eternal house that God will create. See 2 Corinthians 5:1-4. So Paul draws upon a mixed set of metaphors, contrasting a tent with a permanent dwelling and old clothing with new clothing. His meaning is subtle but clear. To die is to be in a naked state, unclothed, without a proper dwelling, whereas to be resurrected from the dead is to be reclothed or rehoused with a new spiritual body. So that's very different from the original corpse being resuscitated. It's the supplanting of an old body with a new body, just as he believed that the old covenant was supposed to be utterly supplanted by the new covenant, and why he has such a low view of the Torah. He wants, in his theology, the Torah of Christ exists to replace the Torah of Moses, which would have been decidedly antithetical to the understanding of the Old Covenant as held by Jesus and the apostles. And you can see that in the way that Paul disingenuously implies in many places that to uphold the Torah was to believe that one was justified by the law, but that is not what Judaism traditionally taught. So anyway, he talks about the Greek objection to the resurrection of the dead appearing in the book of Acts with the Stoics and Epicureans mocking Paul in Athens as soon as he mentions the idea of resurrection. Um, and then, he points out that the Corinthians challenged Paul directly with these same questions. How are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? And then he tells them, he explains his view quite clearly. There's a physical body and then there's a spiritual body. The first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. It is not the spiritual that is first, but the physical and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. And just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. And then he concludes in verse 50 of chapter 15 in 1 Corinthians, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. So this is, next section is a little more important, so I'll try to read more of it verbatim. Paul's understanding of Jesus' resurrection allows us to approach with a new perspective the question of what happened to Jesus' body after he was taken from the cross. Paul begins his resurrection chapter with a formula-like recitation of what he calls the gospel. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-4. Paul is writing this around 25 years after Jesus' crucifixion. And since he was not a witness to the death, burial, and resurrection on the third day, he passes along something he has, quote unquote, received to the Corinthians. Most scholars take this to mean that he is passing on a formal early Christian creed that he got from the Jerusalem apostles, or perhaps from Christians at Antioch. Although this is possible, I don't think it is at all certain, since Paul, and this is a very important point here, swears so adamantly that the gospel he, quote, received was not through men or from men, but by a direct revelation of Christ. Galatians 1:11-12. Earlier in 1 Corinthians, he writes that he, quote, received from the Lord, same Greek verb, meaning from Jesus, his tradition about the Lord's Supper. So all of this is uniquely Pauline, and he's claiming that he doesn't get any of his information from the apostles. He doesn't care about the 12 or what they know or what they think they know. Nor does he care very much about the earthly Jesus or what Jesus taught. There's little to nothing in Paul about the sayings of Jesus or the teachings of Jesus or the preaching of Jesus or his parables or anything of that nature. All he's interested in is the crucifixion and the resurrection, the burial and the resurrection on the third day. That informs his entire theology. Either way, whether by tradition or revelation, Paul offers his testimony of what he preaches. Paul then lists a series of sightings, quote unquote, of the risen Christ to various people, including Peter, James, and the 12, and finally his own experience of having seen Jesus. Two conclusions seem to follow from Paul's formulaic testimony. First, since Paul emphatically makes the point in 1 Corinthians that the resurrected Christ dwells in a spiritual body as a life-giving spirit, we can say with assurance that the Christ that Paul claimed to have seen was not Jesus' physical corpse revivified. According to Paul, the Lord, that is Jesus, is the Spirit, quote unquote, 2 Corinthians 3:17-18. Second, since Paul equates his experience of seeing Christ with the experiences of the Jerusalem apostles who were before him, we can conclude that, at least in Paul's view of the matter, their experiences were identical in this case. They all saw the same risen Christ in his glorified spiritual body. Since Paul explicitly says that Christ died and was buried, but was subsequently raised from the dead, he most likely believed that Jesus' physical body returned to the dust, and like a change of old clothing, had nothing to do with the new spiritual body Jesus received. His reference to Jesus' burial was to make the point that he was truly dead. Okay, that's also something very important to understand. Paul clearly believes in a bodily resurrection, or more properly, an embodied resurrection. It is one thing to say the dead will be raised bodily, and it is quite another to insist that the same bodies, long ago turned to dust and ashes or buried at sea, must somehow be reconstituted in order to experience resurrection. I'm not going to read the rest of that section. You get the point. This is good background, like I said, for some other sections of this book that we're going to be covering here very soon.